Hello, and welcome to History at Bedtime. On a June morning in the year 793, a fleet of longships appeared out of the North Sea and beached on the tidal flats below the monastery of Lindisfarne, a sacred island off the northeastern coast of England. The men who came ashore were armed. They moved through the monastery's buildings with speed and violence, killing some of the monks, taking others captive, throwing the bodies of the dead into the sea, looting the altar vessels and the accumulated treasure of generations of Christian devotion, and departing as quickly as they had arrived, leaving behind a community shattered and a coastline suddenly aware of a new kind of danger from the sea. The raid on Lindisfarne entered the medieval consciousness as a trauma. A Northumbrian scholar named Alcuin, writing from the court of Charlemagne where he served as an advisor, described the attack with a genuine horror that the surviving text still conveys. Never before had such a terror appeared in Britain. The pagans had come from the north. The church of a saint had been stained with the blood of priests. A new world had announced itself with violence on a holy island. But the world that had announced itself was considerably more complex than the raid on Lindisfarne suggests. The people who would become known across medieval Europe as the Vikings, the Norse seafarers of Scandinavia who spread outward across the Atlantic, across the Eastern European river systems, across the Mediterranean, across the North Sea and the Irish Sea and the Baltic, were not simply raiders. They were also traders of extraordinary range, conducting commercial networks that connected the furs and amber and slaves of the north to the silver dirhams of the Islamic world and the silk of Byzantium. They were settlers, founding or transforming major urban centers such as Dublin and shaping the Rus world around places such as Novgorod and Kyiv, colonizing Iceland and Greenland and reaching Newfoundland more than 5 centuries before Columbus crossed the Atlantic. They were explorers, the first Europeans to reach North America, their ships among the most sophisticated sailing vessels in the medieval world. They were poets, composers of skaldic verse and the Eddic poetry that preserved the mythology of the Norse gods in forms of real literary sophistication. They were farmers and craftsmen and lawgivers, and they helped shape political traditions that would later matter to several modern nations. The story of the Vikings is not the simple story of violent northerners descending on civilized Europe. It is the story of a culture of extraordinary energy and extraordinary complexity, operating for roughly 3 centuries across an enormous geographical range, connecting worlds that had previously been separated, and leaving marks on the landscapes and languages and political structures of a dozen countries that are still visible today. This story follows them across the cold North Sea in their extraordinary ships, into the monasteries they raided and the markets where they traded and the farms they settled, through the mythology that organized their understanding of the world, across the Atlantic to the shores of Newfoundland, and finally into the long process by which the Norse world entered Christian medieval Europe without entirely losing the memory of what it had been. Before the story moves any further, one basic point matters. Viking was not, originally, the name of a race or a single unified nation. It described an activity, a way of going out on expedition. A man could go Viking. He could raid, trade, seek silver, serve as a mercenary, explore new coasts, or attach himself to a leader with enough reputation to make a voyage worth risking. The people involved were Norse, Danish, Norwegian, Swedish, Icelandic, or members of mixed communities that formed wherever Scandinavian travelers settled. Modern language often uses the word Viking for all of them together because it is convenient, but the historical reality was more fluid. Not every Scandinavian was a Viking. Not every Viking was a raider. And not every raider remained a raider for long. That distinction matters because the popular image of the Vikings is powerful but incomplete. The helmeted barbarian, roaring out of a misty sea, is a dramatic figure, but he is not enough to explain 3 centuries of history. Violence was real. The raids were terrifying. Monasteries burned. Captives were sold. Silver was torn from altars and carried north across the sea. But the same ships that carried raiders also carried wool, furs, walrus ivory, iron, amber, slaves, carved bone, combs, weapons, poetry, legal customs, marriages, languages, and gods. The Viking Age was not one thing. It was a movement of people, goods, stories, technologies, and ambitions across a world whose edges suddenly became more connected than they had been before. The medieval writers who first described the Norse often saw them at the most frightening moments. A monk watching armed men enter a church did not see the farm that fed them, the women who wove their sails, the shipwrights who shaped their keels, the merchants who weighed their silver, or the children learning the rules of honor in a smoky hall during the long winter. He saw violence, and he wrote violence. His testimony is valuable, but it is partial. Archaeology, place names, runic inscriptions, ship burials, silver hoards, town excavations, and the later Icelandic sagas allow a fuller picture to emerge. It is a picture of a society hard enough to do terrible things and sophisticated enough to build one of the most mobile cultures of the medieval world. The Viking Age, roughly from the late 8th century to the late 11th, was therefore not simply an age of raids. It was an age of acceleration. Scandinavian ships moved faster than most political systems could react. Scandinavian traders reached markets that had never seen them before. Scandinavian settlers created new communities on islands that had been empty or nearly empty. Scandinavian warriors entered the service of foreign rulers from Ireland to Byzantium. And across the same 3 centuries, the Old Norse world itself changed from a loose web of farms, chieftains, assemblies, and pagan cults into the Christian kingdoms of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. The landscape that produced the Vikings, the long fjords and rocky coasts and forested hills of Scandinavia, shaped them as completely as any culture has ever been shaped by its geography. Norway in particular, with its coastline so deeply indented by fjords that the total length of coast, if straightened, would reach halfway around the equator, and its interior so dominated by mountains and forests that overland travel was difficult and sea travel was often the only practical option, was a place where the relationship between people and water was not optional, but foundational. Children grew up on boats. The sea was not something you approached with caution, but something you lived on and from, and the technical mastery of seafaring that Norse culture developed across many generations reflected a relationship with the ocean that was as intimate as the relationship between a pastoral people and their herds. Most Norse people, even during the most active centuries of raiding and exploration, lived not as professional sea warriors, but as farmers. The farm was the center of ordinary life, and the longhouse was its heart. A Norse longhouse could vary greatly in size, from a modest farm building to an enormous hall belonging to a powerful chieftain, but its basic logic was the same. A long rectangular structure of timber, turf, or stone depending on local materials, with a central hearth, benches or raised platforms along the walls, animals sometimes housed at one end in colder regions, and human life gathered around fire, smoke, work, storytelling, and sleep. The hall was a place of warmth and food, but also of status. Where one sat in the hall mattered. Who served whom mattered. Who received gifts from the chieftain mattered. Social order was visible in the arrangement of bodies around the fire. A free farmer's household might include the farmer, his wife, their children, elderly relatives, hired workers, servants, and enslaved people. The household was an economic unit, not simply a family in the modern sentimental sense. It produced food, cloth, tools, animals, reputation, and heirs. Women managed much of the domestic economy: dairy production, textile work, storage, keys, household distribution, and the supervision of servants. The bunch of keys carried by a high-status Norse woman was not merely practical. It was a symbol of authority over the household stores, over the locked chests and food supplies on which survival through winter depended. A household could not function without that management, and the archaeological evidence of women's graves, with keys, brooches, beads, weaving tools, and imported goods, makes clear that wealth and status in Norse society were not only male possessions. Textiles were among the most important products of the Norse world, and among the least glamorous in popular imagination because they do not survive as dramatically as swords and ships. But the sail of a longship was a technological object of enormous labor. Wool had to be sheared, cleaned, spun, woven, treated, cut, and maintained. A single large sail represented months of work, often by women, and without sails the Viking Age could not have happened in the form it did. The heroic image of men crossing the sea depends on the quieter labor of those who made the fabric that caught the wind. The same is true of clothing. Woolen tunics, cloaks, dresses, hoods, stockings, belts, and shoes were not accessories but survival technologies in a northern climate where cold and damp could kill as surely as an enemy's blade. Food was simple but not monotonous. Barley, rye, oats, and, in some regions, wheat formed the grain base of the diet, made into bread, porridge, and ale. Cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, and chickens provided milk, meat, eggs, hides, and wool. Fish was essential along the coasts and rivers, especially in Norway and Iceland, where dried fish could be stored and traded. Dairy products, cheese, butter, skyr like cultured milk products in Icelandic contexts, helped convert summer abundance into winter survival. Wild resources mattered as well. Berries, nuts, game, seabirds, eggs, seaweed, and in the far north, seals and whales. The Norse table was shaped by season. Summer was labor and preparation. Winter was endurance and consumption of what had been stored. Enslaved people, called thralls, were part of this world, and any honest account of the Vikings must keep them visible. Norse society was slaveholding. Captives taken in raids could be kept as laborers, sold in markets, ransomed, given as gifts, or moved through long-distance trade networks toward Ireland, England, the Frankish world, Byzantium, or the Islamic lands. Thralls worked farms, households, workshops, and estates. Some might eventually be freed, becoming freed people with limited status, but many lived and died unfree. The slave trade was not a side detail of Viking activity. It was one of the economic motives that made raiding profitable, and it connected the Scandinavian world to a much larger medieval market in human beings. Law and reputation held this society together in the absence of strong, centralized state power. Insult mattered. Oaths mattered. Compensation for injury and killing mattered. Feuds could destroy families if not managed through legal settlements, marriage alliances, compensation payments, or exile. The Thing Assembly was the place where disputes were heard and judgments made. But judgment was only as strong as the willingness of kin groups and neighbors to enforce it. A person without allies was vulnerable. A person declared outlaw was effectively pushed outside the protection of the community. Honor in this world was not an abstract virtue. It was a practical social currency, the thing that determined whether others would stand with you when conflict came. The technology of the Viking ship was among the most significant technical achievements of the medieval world, and no account of the Norse expansion can adequately explain what happened without taking seriously the revolution in shipbuilding that underpinned it. The clinker-built hull, in which overlapping strakes of oak planking were riveted together and caulked with moss and animal hair, to create a flexible structure that could bend and flex in heavy seas without breaking, produced a vessel of extraordinary seaworthiness combined with remarkable speed and versatility. The longship, optimized for speed and for operation in both open ocean and shallow coastal waters, could be rowed or sailed, drew so little water that it could be beached directly on a shore or navigated far up rivers, and was light enough that it could be dragged overland across portages between river systems. This combination of capabilities, deep sea sailing, coastal raiding, river navigation, portage, made the Viking longship one of the most versatile military and commercial vehicles in the pre-industrial world, and the Norse expansion would simply not have been possible without it. The Gokstad ship, discovered buried under a burial mound in Norway in 1880 and now preserved by the Museum of the Viking Age in Oslo, gives the clearest physical sense of what a Viking longship was. 24 meters long and about 5 meters wide at its widest point, with a mast that could carry a large square sail and 16 pairs of oars for when the wind failed or was unfavorable. It was built to carry a crew of approximately 35 men across the open North Sea. The Gokstad ship also became the model for modern experimental reconstructions, including a 19th century replica that crossed the Atlantic to the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893. These voyages did not reproduce Viking navigation perfectly, but they demonstrated something important. The hull form preserved in the grave mound was not a fantasy of saga literature. It was a real ocean-going technology, capable of making the long crossings that the sources describe. The ship heeled dramatically in rough weather, its flexible hull absorbing rather than resisting the energy of the waves, a quality that its modern crew found alarming, but that its medieval builders had understood and deliberately designed for. The flexibility was not a weakness, but a feature. The longship was only one part of a broader maritime technology. Norse shipbuilders made different vessels for different purposes. The fast, narrow warship was suited to raiding and military transport, but cargo ships, broader, deeper, slower, built to carry heavy loads, were equally important to Norse success. A trader moving walrus ivory from Greenland, furs from the north, or bulk goods across the Baltic did not need the narrowest raiding ship. He needed space, stability, and carrying capacity. The Viking Age was made by both kinds of vessel, the sharp ship that appeared suddenly at a monastery shore, and the heavier ship that moved goods between trading towns. Navigation in the Viking world combined skill, memory, observation, and experience. Norse sailors read coastlines, wave patterns, winds, birds, currents, clouds, the color of the sea, and the behavior of marine life. They used the sun and stars when visible, but northern weather often made visibility uncertain, and sailing across open water required a body of practical knowledge that was learned by doing, inherited through voyages, and carried in the memory of experienced pilots. The sagas sometimes speak in terms that sound almost magical to modern readers. Men who know the sea, who can judge distance by wind and light. But beneath that language is the reality of accumulated expertise. A sailor who had crossed from Norway to Iceland, or from Iceland to Greenland, knew the feel of the route in ways that could not be reduced to a map. The ship was also a social machine. A crew was not a random collection of individuals. It was a group bound by hierarchy, obligation, hope of profit, and shared risk. Oarsmen had to work together. Men had to sleep in exposed conditions, eat what could be carried, endure cold spray and cramped space, and trust the judgment of the steersman and the leader. A voyage could produce wealth, but it could also end in drowning, starvation, shipwreck, or a hostile shore. The willingness of men to join an expedition depended on the leader's reputation. Had he rewarded followers before? Did he have luck? Did he have good ships? Did he have information about profitable targets or markets? Leadership in the Viking Age was performative and practical at once. A chief had to look generous, speak well, give gifts, win fights, and bring his people home with something worth the danger. The beauty of the ships mattered too. The carved prows, the painted shields along the gunwales, the disciplined line of oars, the square sail catching the wind. These were not merely functional details, but statements of identity. A longship arriving off a coast was a sight as well as a threat. It announced organization, technology, wealth, and confidence. To those on shore, it could mean terror. To those aboard, it could mean pride. The same object could be a weapon, a home, a grave good, a status symbol, and a work of art. The social world from which the raiders and traders and settlers came was organized around the household and the local community rather than around any larger political structure, at least in the early centuries of the Viking Age. Scandinavia in the 8th and 9th centuries was not organized into kingdoms in the medieval European sense, but into a more fluid arrangement of local chieftains and petty kings whose authority was personal rather than institutional, whose power depended on their ability to attract and retain followers, and whose territory was defined by the range of that personal authority rather than by fixed borders. The Thing, the assembly of free men that met regularly to settle disputes, pass judgments, and make collective decisions, was a fundamental institution of Norse political life, and the tradition of collective deliberation and judgment that it represented was real even within a society that was also hierarchical and that gave considerable authority to men of wealth and fighting ability. The reasons for the Viking expansion are still debated by historians, and the answer is probably not simple. Population pressure in the relatively limited agricultural land available in Norway and Denmark may have pushed men towards seeking opportunities elsewhere. The development of the longship and the accumulated seafaring expertise of Scandinavian culture created the technical capacity for expansion that earlier centuries had lacked. The fragmentation of political authority in early medieval Europe, the end of Charlemagne's empire, the weakness of the English kingdoms, the ongoing struggles within the Frankish successor states, created opportunities that were not available when stronger central authorities could have organized effective coastal defense. The concentration of wealth in the monasteries and churches of early medieval Christianity made specific targets extremely attractive. These institutions accumulated silver and gold and jeweled objects through the donations of the faithful, and they were often located on coasts or rivers that made them accessible to seaborne raiders who could strike and withdraw before any organized military response could arrive. The first generation of Viking activity in the late 8th and early 9th centuries was primarily raiding, hit and run attacks on coastal and riverside targets in Britain, Ireland, and Francia, the accumulation of portable wealth through violence, and the return home with silver and slaves and reputation. The pattern of these early raids, the sudden appearance, the violence, the departure, reflected the specific military logic of raiding. Small forces could achieve substantial results against unprepared targets, the key military advantage being surprise and speed, and there was no reason to risk the disadvantage that fighting more organized military forces on land would entail. But the raiding pattern evolved fairly quickly into something more complex. Viking forces began to winter in the territories they had been raiding rather than returning home after each campaign season, creating semi-permanent bases from which operations could be conducted over extended periods. The Long Fort, the fortified ship harbor, appears in the Irish sources in the 840s as a feature of Viking operations in Ireland, a defended enclosure that protected the fleet during the winter and served as a base for operations across a wider area. The Long Fort at Dublin, established around 841, was the origin of what would become the city of Dublin, and the same process, a raiding base gradually becoming a settlement, produced similar foundations across the Viking world. The monasteries were attractive targets not because the Vikings had some uniquely anti-Christian program in the earliest raids, but because monasteries concentrated portable wealth in places with limited military protection. Silver chalices, reliquaries, book covers, altar fittings, fine textiles, and livestock could be seized quickly. Monks could be taken for ransom or sold. A monastery also carried symbolic power, and that is why Christian writers recorded the attacks with such horror, but from the raiders' economic perspective, the practical appeal was obvious. The early Viking raid was a business model built on speed, intelligence, and asymmetry. Strike a rich place that cannot defend itself, take what can be carried, leave before a regional force arrives. That brutality should not be softened. Raiding destroyed lives. It shattered communities. It fed slave markets. It created terror along coasts and rivers where people had previously understood danger in different terms. But it should also be understood in the violent context of early medieval Europe, where Frankish armies, Anglo-Saxon kings, Slavic war bands, Irish dynasts, and other powers also raided, enslaved, burned, and extracted tribute when they could. What made the Vikings distinctive was not that they alone were violent, but that their maritime technology allowed them to apply violence across astonishing distances with unusual speed and unpredictability. Trade and raiding often occupied the same world, and sometimes the same individuals. A crew might trade where conditions favored trade and raid where conditions favored raiding. A man who sold furs in one port might seize captives in another. The moral categories were not as clean as later narratives want them to be. Medieval economies were not separated into respectable commerce and criminal violence in the modern sense. Power and trade were intertwined. The ability to defend oneself, to threaten others, to negotiate, to pay, to take hostages, to swear oaths, and to enforce agreements were all part of the same practical world. Silver was the great magnet. The Scandinavian economy of the Viking Age was not primarily coin-based in the way later medieval economies would become, but silver was weighed, cut, tested, gifted, worn, and hoarded. Hack silver, chopped pieces of jewelry, coins, ingots, and ornaments, functioned as portable value. A beautiful arm ring could be displayed as status, cut up as payment, or buried as a reserve. Hoards found across Scandinavia and the British Isles show this material world with extraordinary clarity. Arabic dirhams, Anglo-Saxon pennies, Frankish coins, brooches, bars, rings, and fragments, all mixed together by weight rather than by original minting authority. Silver was memory made material, the record of voyages, raids, payments, markets, alliances, and fears. Trading towns emerged as nodes in this system. Hedeby, near the base of the Jutland Peninsula, was one of the most important commercial centers of the Viking world, positioned where routes between the North Sea and the Baltic could be controlled. Birka in Sweden connected the Baltic to routes into the east. Koppang in Norway linked local production to wider Scandinavian trade. Jorvik, the Viking city of York, became a major urban center in England, with workshops, craftspeople, merchants, and a mixed Anglo-Scandinavian population. These towns were noisy, dirty, crowded, and dynamic, full of smoke, animals, metalworking, leatherworking, bone carving, ship repair, bargaining, and languages from multiple regions. The Viking Age was as much an urban commercial age as it was a heroic seafaring one. Ireland felt the Norse presence with particular intensity during the 9th century. The island's numerous monasteries, which had been centers of remarkable cultural achievement during the previous 2 centuries, producing illuminated manuscripts of extraordinary beauty like the Book of Kells, preserving classical learning during the period when the European mainland was most disrupted, sending missionaries across Britain and the continent, were exactly the kind of targets that the Viking raiders sought. Wealthy, accessible from the sea, and initially undefended by any military force capable of repelling seaborne attack, the Irish monasteries were raided repeatedly in the 820s and 830s, and the experience of Viking attack became embedded in Irish cultural memory in ways that shaped Irish writing and Irish attitudes toward the Norse for generations. The Irish response to the Viking presence was more varied than the simple narrative of Christian civilization under attack suggests. Irish kings made alliances with Norse leaders when it suited their political purposes. Irish women and Norse men had children together whose mixed heritage was acknowledged in the term Gall Gaedel, foreign Irish, or Gaelicized foreigners, used for the communities of mixed Norse-Irish identity that developed in various parts of Ireland. Norse traders established themselves in Dublin and Waterford and Limerick and Cork, creating the commercial centers that would become the primary urban settlements of medieval Ireland, since the pre-Viking Irish tradition had not developed towns of any significant size. By the late 9th and 10th centuries, the Norse presence in Ireland was as much commercial and urban as it was military. England experienced a similar evolution from raiding to settlement. The great heathen army that arrived in East Anglia in 865 and proceeded over the following years to conquer most of northern and eastern England, defeating and killing the king of Northumbria, defeating and killing the king of East Anglia, and at one point controlling most of the country except for the southwestern kingdom of Wessex, was not simply a raiding force writ large, but a settlement enterprise conducted through military means. The Danelaw, the territory of England that came under Scandinavian control following this conquest, and the subsequent political settlements of the 870s and 880s, was genuinely settled by Norse immigrants who brought their own agricultural practices, their own legal traditions, their own place name conventions, and their own linguistic habits. The distinctively Norse place names that cluster in eastern and northern England today, the by-endings of Grimsby, Whitby, Derby, Rugby, the Thorpe endings of dozens of villages, the Thwaite of many farmsteads, are the fossilized record of Norse settlement, the names of farms and villages given by settlers who spoke Old Norse and who described the landscape around them in the vocabulary of their own language. The most famous confrontation between Viking ambition and English resistance was the sustained conflict between the Danish king Guthrum and the West Saxon king Alfred, who came to the throne of Wessex in 871 in circumstances of military crisis that seemed likely to end in his kingdom's conquest. Alfred's survival of the winter of 877 to 878, when Guthrum launched a surprise attack that drove him into hiding in the Somerset marshes with a tiny following while Viking forces occupied most of his kingdom, and his subsequent emergence to rally the West Saxon forces and defeat Guthrum at the Battle of Edington in 878, is one of the great survival stories of early medieval history, and the political settlement that followed, in which Guthrum converted to Christianity with Alfred as his godfather and agreed to withdraw north of a boundary that divided England roughly diagonally, established the basic political geography of late Anglo-Saxon England. Alfred's response to the Viking threat went beyond military survival. He reorganized the West Saxon military system, creating a network of fortified towns, the boroughs, that provided defensible strongpoints throughout Wessex, ensuring that no Viking force could operate freely through the kingdom without encountering organized resistance at close intervals. He rebuilt the English fleet. He translated Latin texts into English so that his people could read them in their own language, and he promoted literacy among the clergy and the nobility as a tool of governance and cultural resilience. He preserved texts and patronized scholarship at a moment when the Viking disruption of the early 9th century had seriously damaged the networks of learning and manuscript copying that sustained Anglo-Saxon literacy. He was, by any reasonable assessment, one of the most effective rulers of his age, and his Englishness, his identification with the people he governed, represented something new. The beginning of an English national identity organized around the shared experience of resisting the Norse. The Danelaw was not simply a military zone on a map. It became a lived cultural frontier, a region where Scandinavian settlers and Anglo-Saxon populations interacted over generations in fields, villages, markets, marriages, lawsuits, and churches. The evidence of this contact is everywhere in the place names, in personal names, in sculpture, in law codes, and eventually in language itself. Norse settlement did not erase the English population. It layered new people, new legal customs, and new vocabulary onto an existing society, creating a hybrid world in which a man might have a Norse name, live in a village with an Old Norse place name, farmland that had been worked for centuries by English families, and worship in a church whose stone carving combined Christian imagery with Scandinavian artistic forms. Jorvik to the Norse is the clearest archaeological picture of this hybrid urban life. Excavations in the waterlogged deposits of Coppergate revealed preserved timbers, leather, textiles, tools, animal bones, seeds, insects, human waste, and ordinary household debris in such abundance that scholars can reconstruct aspects of daily life with unusual intimacy. The city was a place of craftsmen, antler workers making combs, metal workers producing fittings and ornaments, leather workers cutting shoes, merchants handling goods from far beyond England. It was also a place of smells, smoke, animals, tanning, fish, human waste, cooking, and of density. The romantic image of the Viking as a lone warrior gives way here to something more historically important: an urban Scandinavian community embedded in the economic life of northern England. Alfred's victory did not end the Scandinavian presence in England. It contained it, negotiated with it, and forced it into a political structure that later West Saxon kings could gradually absorb. Alfred's descendants, especially his daughter Ethelflaed of Mercia and his grandson Athelstan, continued the work of fortification, diplomacy, and conquest that eventually produced a more unified English kingdom. The Viking challenge, paradoxically, helped make England. It forced the southern English kingdoms to organize more tightly, to build fortified networks, to think in broader territorial terms, and to define themselves against an external pressure that was also increasingly internal. The enemy became neighbor. The invader became settler. The settlement became part of the country. The Norse in France, the Normans, the Northmen, followed a trajectory that in some respects mirrors the English experience, but that produced very different political outcomes. Viking forces raided the Seine Valley repeatedly from the late 8th century onward, sailing deep into the Frankish heartland to attack Paris and other inland targets with a boldness that the Frankish kings found extremely difficult to resist effectively. The political settlement of 911, in which the Frankish king Charles the Simple granted the Viking leader Rollo and his followers a large territory at the mouth of the Seine, which they and their descendants would develop into the Duchy of Normandy, represents the same basic dynamic as the English Danelaw. Viking military power too effective to be expelled, converted into permanent settlement through negotiated acknowledgement of territorial control. The Normans who descended from Rollo's followers over the following century and a half underwent one of the most thoroughgoing cultural transformations in medieval history. They adopted the French language, abandoning Old Norse within a few generations. They converted to Christianity with a thoroughness that made Normandy, by the 11th century, one of the most aggressively reforming and most intensely Christian areas of France. They adopted Frankish military customs, including castle building and heavily armored cavalry warfare, and developed these into the devastatingly effective military system that conquered England in 1066, established control over Sicily and southern Italy in the 1040s and 1050s, and provided the leadership of the First Crusade at the end of the 11th century. In 3 generations, the descendants of Viking raiders had become the most effective military force in the medieval West, their Norse origins almost completely absorbed into a French-speaking Catholic culture that bore little obvious resemblance to the world their ancestors had come from. Normandy shows the speed with which Norse identity could transform when circumstances rewarded adaptation. Rollo and his followers did not become French overnight, but their descendants quickly learned that survival and advancement in the Frankish world required Christian legitimacy, written charters, Latin clerics, stone churches, mounted warfare, and marriage into local aristocratic networks. Norse speech faded. French speech replaced it. Pagan gods disappeared from public life. The descendants of sea raiders became dukes who patronized monasteries, built castles, enforced feudal obligations, and presented themselves as legitimate Christian rulers. Yet something of the Norse inheritance remained in the intensity and mobility of Norman ambition. The same willingness to cross water and seize opportunity that had brought their ancestors to the Seine carried their descendants to England, southern Italy, Sicily, Antioch, and beyond. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 was not a Viking raid, but it was one of the long consequences of the Viking Age. A Norse settlement became a French duchy. A French duchy produced an army. That army crossed the Channel and remade England. History rarely moves in straight lines. The wake of a longship could take a century and a half to reach its final shore. The Norse movement eastward, along the river systems of Eastern Europe, is one of the less well-known but most historically consequential aspects of the Viking Age. The rivers of what is now Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, the Volga, the Dnieper, the Don, connect the Baltic Sea to the Caspian and to the Black Sea, and the Norse traders and warriors who found their way into this river system in the early 9th century were following routes that led ultimately to the Islamic Caliphate and to the Byzantine Empire. The Norse in the East are known to Arab sources as the Rus, a name whose etymology is debated but which appears to derive from a Finnish word for Sweden, and their trading activities, principally in furs, amber, and slaves, exchanged for the silver dirhams that circulated in enormous quantities through the Islamic world, generated one of the most significant commercial flows of the early medieval period. The hordes of Arabic silver coins found across Scandinavia, hundreds of thousands of individual coins, found in deposits buried across Sweden and Norway and Denmark, are the physical evidence of this Eastern trade. The silver that came north from the Islamic world along the Volga route, finding its way into the hands of Norse traders and eventually into the earth, where archaeologists find it today. The scale of this silver flow was enormous by early medieval standards, and it fueled a demand for the slave and fur supply that the Norse provided from the forests and the peoples of the north, creating a commercial system that linked the Norse world to the Islamic world across thousands of kilometers of river and steppe. The city of Kyiv, on the Dnieper River became the political center of the Rus state that developed through the 9th and 10th centuries, a state whose ruling elite included Norse or Varangian elements, but whose population was predominantly Slavic and whose culture was increasingly a Slavic-Norse synthesis. The legendary Rurik, traditionally considered the founder of the Rurikid dynasty, is described in the chronicles as a Norse leader invited by the Slavic peoples of the north to come and rule over them, a foundation legend that cannot be treated as simple documentary fact, but that reflects a genuine historical discussion about Norse political leadership, Slavic society, and the formation of the Rus political world. Vladimir the Great, who converted Kievan Rus to Orthodox Christianity in 988, and whose descendants ruled across the Rus principalities and later Muscovite Russia for centuries, was a Rurikid, in the broadest sense, a descendant of the dynasty associated with those Norse adventurers who had made the Eastern river system their commercial and political domain. The Eastern route complicates the familiar Western image of the Vikings more than any other part of their history. In the West, the sources often show them as raiders. In the East, they appear as traders, mercenaries, rulers, and middlemen in a commercial system of extraordinary scale. A Swedish or Gotlandic trader could move downriver through a sequence of waterways and portages toward the Volga, the Caspian, the Black Sea, and the markets of the Islamic and Byzantine worlds. At each stage, local knowledge mattered. Boats had to be dragged around rapids. Goods had to be guarded. Agreements had to be made with Slavic, Finnic, Baltic, Khazar, Bulgar, and other communities whose territories controlled the route. The journey was not a simple Viking highway, but a complex negotiated corridor through many people's lands. The Arabic sources that describe the Rus are among the most vivid external accounts of Norse-related peoples. Ibn Fadlan, a 10th century envoy from the Abbasid Caliphate who encountered Rus traders on the Volga, described them with fascination and disgust. Tall, tattooed or body-marked, armed, obsessed with appearance, careless by his standards about cleanliness, and practicing a dramatic ship cremation for a dead chieftain that remains one of the most discussed passages in the study of Viking Age ritual. His account is not a neutral ethnography. It reflects the values and prejudices of a Muslim observer encountering people whose customs shocked him, but it is invaluable because it records a world of trade, slavery, ritual, and cultural encounter far from the monasteries of England. Kyiv's relationship to the Viking world should be stated carefully. The city was not simply founded by Vikings in any easy sense. It existed within a Slavic and steppe frontier world, and its later importance came from the development of a Rus polity whose ruling and trading elites included people of Scandinavian origin who were gradually Slavicized. That distinction matters because the history of Kyiv belongs to more than one modern national narrative, and reducing it to a simple Viking foundation erases the Slavic, steppe, Byzantine, and local dimensions of the city. What the Norse did was not to invent the East from nothing, but to enter existing networks, dominate some of them, connect others to wider trade, and help create a political formation whose consequences would reach deep into the histories of Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus. The Varangian Guard in Byzantium is another example of Norse adaptability. To serve as a guard of the Byzantine emperor was to enter one of the most sophisticated court cultures in the medieval world, a universe of ceremony, silk, gold, theology, bureaucracy, and political intrigue that could hardly have been more different from a Scandinavian hall. Yet Norse and later Anglo-Saxon warriors became part of it, valued precisely because they were foreign enough to be personally loyal to the emperor rather than entangled in local Byzantine aristocratic faction. Their axes, their size, their language, and their reputation made them distinctive. Their pay and prestige made the service attractive. Men who had grown up beside the Baltic or the North Sea could end their careers inside the palace complex of Constantinople, guarding a ruler who claimed continuity with Rome. The Norse relationship with Byzantium was equally significant, though differently structured. Norse warriors served in the Byzantine army as the Varangian Guard, an elite mercenary force that guarded the person of the Byzantine emperor and served as a shock force in Byzantine military campaigns from the late 10th century onward. The Varangians left physical evidence of their presence in Constantinople. Runic inscriptions carved into the marble balustrade of the Hagia Sophia, apparently by bored guardsmen waiting during long religious ceremonies, are among the most unexpected monuments to Norse literacy in the medieval world. Viking graffiti in the greatest church of Byzantine Christianity. The Arabic silver that came north along the Volga and the Byzantine gold and silk that came from the south along the Dnieper made the Norse commercial empire of the East one of the most productive trading enterprises of the medieval period. The Norse mythology that organized the religious and cosmological understanding of the Viking world was a system of considerable complexity and considerable literary sophistication, preserved primarily in the Icelandic texts of the 12th and 13th centuries, centuries after the Christianization of Scandinavia, but clearly reflecting a much older oral tradition whose roots extended deep into the pre-Christian Norse world. The two primary mythological collections, the Prose Edda compiled by the Icelandic scholar Snorri Sturluson around 1220, and the Poetic Edda, a collection of earlier mythological poems preserved in the Codex Regius manuscript of the late 13th century, give us an extraordinarily detailed picture of Norse religious thinking that has no parallel in most other pre-Christian European traditions, whose mythology is much more fragmentarily preserved. The Norse cosmology organized the universe as a series of 9 worlds arranged around and within the great cosmic tree Yggdrasil, the world Ash, whose roots reached into the realm of the dead and whose branches extended into the heavens. At the center of this cosmic geography was Midgard, Middle Earth, the world of human beings, surrounded by the world ocean and bounded by the great serpent Jormungandr, who encircled the world and bit his own tail. Above was Asgard, the realm of the Aesir gods, connected to Midgard by the rainbow bridge Bifrost. Below were Helheim, the realm of the ordinary dead, and Niflheim, a realm of ice and cold. Around the edges of the cosmos were the giants, the Jotnar, who were not simply villains but complex figures in the mythological narrative, sometimes allies and sometimes enemies of the gods, often sexually attractive to the gods themselves, and carrying in their vast and chaotic nature something of the primordial forces from which the ordered cosmos had been made. Odin, All-Father, the one-eyed god of wisdom, poetry, war, and death, was the most complex and most fascinating figure in the Norse pantheon, a deity whose pursuit of knowledge took him to extreme lengths that no other god of any tradition quite parallels. He hung himself on Yggdrasil for 9 days and 9 nights, wounded by his own spear, in order to discover the runes, the sacred alphabet that carried magical power, sacrificing himself to himself in an act of self-mortification that produced wisdom at the cost of suffering. He gave one of his eyes to drink from the well of Mimir, the well of cosmic wisdom, in exchange for a single drink of the water that conferred understanding. He transformed himself into various forms to move through the world incognito, sitting at the hearths of ordinary people and testing them, rewarding generosity and punishing meanness, a divine wanderer in a gray cloak and wide-brimmed hat who might be encountered at any crossroads by anyone who knew what to look for. The Valkyries, Odin's choosers of the slain, rode across the battlefields of the world selecting the warriors who would die, bringing half of the honored dead to Valhalla, Odin's hall in Asgard, where they would feast and fight each day in preparation for Ragnarok, the final battle at the end of the world. This mythological structure gave Norse warrior culture a specific theological framework that valorized death in battle as a desirable fate, not because it was painless, but because it led to Valhalla, to the company of great warriors, to the continuing glory of the heroic life. The man who died in his bed of old age and illness went to hell, the gray and undifferentiated realm of the ordinary dead, not to Valhalla. The man who died with his sword in his hand, chosen by the Valkyries, went to glory. This theology was not simply consolatory mythology. It had practical consequences for how Norse warriors approached battle and approached death. Thor, the thunder god, Odin's son, the great red bearded warrior with his hammer Mjolnir, was in many respects the most widely worshipped deity of ordinary Norse people, the protective force who drove away the giants and the monsters that threatened the ordered world, the deity of agricultural fertility and of the sky's weather, the patron of the free peasantry who were the backbone of Norse society. Where Odin was aristocratic and mysterious, worshipped particularly by kings and poets and practitioners of seer magic, Thor was democratic and straightforward, a deity whose enthusiasm for fighting giants was matched by his relative inability to match Odin's subtle wisdom. The Thor myths are often comic in their structure. The god of thunder outwitted, disguised, humiliated, and ultimately triumphant through sheer force rather than cleverness. And they reflect a culture that could find humor in its own divinities without diminishing the genuine respect in which they were held. Loki, the trickster, the shapeshifter, the god who was not quite a god, the figure who occupies the most ambiguous and most intellectually interesting position in the Norse pantheon, was the agent of both comedy and catastrophe in Norse mythology, the god whose cleverness resolved problems that his own cleverness had created, whose loyalty to the gods was always slightly suspect and eventually revealed to be false. His role in the death of Balder, the beautiful and beloved god of light, killed by a mistletoe dart thrown by the blind god Hr, while Loki guided the hand that threw it, and his subsequent punishment, chained in a cave beneath the earth with a serpent dripping venom onto his face, while his wife Sigyn caught the drops in a bowl, his writhing when she emptied the bowl causing earthquakes, represents the turn in the mythological narrative toward the darkness of Ragnarok and the ending of the world. Ragnarok, the doom of the gods, the twilight of the powers, is the eschatological vision of the Norse world, the future destruction of the cosmic order that would come at the end of things. The great wolf Fenrir would break his bonds. The Midgard serpent would rise from the ocean. The dead would sail from hell on the ship Naglfar, made from the fingernails of the dead. The gods and the giants would meet in final battle on the plain of Vigrar. Odin would be swallowed by Fenrir. Thor would kill the Midgard serpent and fall dead himself, poisoned by its venom. The world would be consumed by fire and drowned in the sea. And then, from the waters, a new world would rise, green and fertile, and the surviving gods and the surviving humans would build it again. The Norse vision of cosmic destruction followed by renewal is one of the most distinctive features of the mythological tradition, and it reflects a cosmological outlook that is neither optimistic nor pessimistic in simple terms, but genuinely complex. A world in which even the gods are mortal, in which the forces of chaos and order are in constant conflict without final resolution until the end, in which the proper response to this knowledge is neither despair nor denial but continued action, continued fight, continued loyalty to one's companions in the knowledge that defeat is eventually inevitable. This existential stance, whether or not it was articulated in exactly these terms by medieval Norse people, gives the mythology a quality of emotional seriousness that accounts for much of its continuing appeal. Because the surviving mythology comes mainly from Christian Iceland, caution is necessary. Snorri Sturluson and the anonymous compilers of the Eddic poems were not pagan priests writing down their own living religion in the 9th century. They were medieval Christians preserving, organizing, and interpreting inherited stories. Some elements may be very old. Others may have been reshaped by the literary and theological assumptions of the writers who recorded them. The Norse gods we know are therefore both pagan and post-pagan, fragments of an older religious world seen through the careful, sometimes nostalgic, sometimes analytical eyes of Christian descendants. This does not make the mythology false or useless. It makes it historical in a more complicated way. Oral cultures preserve with intensity, but they also change what they preserve. Poems alter. Genealogies adapt. Myths acquire new meanings when the world that first told them has passed. The Eddas are not transparent windows, but they are windows nonetheless, and through them we can see enough of the old Norse imagination to understand why it has never entirely left the modern one. The Norse poetic tradition that preserved and elaborated this mythology was itself a highly developed art form. Skaldic poetry, the court poetry composed by professional poets called skalds who were attached to the households of kings and chieftains, was among the most technically demanding poetry of the medieval world, its intricate verse forms requiring the management of complex meter, elaborate alliteration patterns, and an extensive system of kennings. Compound poetic metaphors in which the sea became the whale rode, and blood became the sweat of the sword, and gold became the fire of the Rhine. The kenning system, which required the poet and the audience to share a deep familiarity with the mythological and legendary tradition from which the metaphors were drawn, was simultaneously a demonstration of literary sophistication and a mechanism for preserving mythological knowledge through constant poetic reference. The Eddic poetry preserved in the Poetic Edda, narrative poems about the gods and the heroes, is different in character from skaldic verse, more direct in its language, more accessible in its narrative structure, though still characterized by the alliterative verse form that was the common heritage of all Germanic poetic tradition. The poems include the Voluspa, the vision of the seeress who recounts the creation of the world, the age of the gods, and the coming of Ragnarok in a prophetic voice of remarkable power. The Havamal, a collection of practical wisdom attributed to Odin that includes advice on hospitality, caution, the management of relationships, and the proper conduct of life that reflects genuine social values of the Norse world. And the heroic poems about figures like Sigurd the Dragon Slayer and the Nibelungs, whose stories were transmitted westward into the Germanic tradition and eventually into Wagner's Ring Cycle. Iceland, colonized by Norse settlers beginning around 870 CE, became the primary repository of the Norse literary and historical tradition, and the Icelandic sagas, prose narratives of extraordinary sophistication composed mostly in the 12th and 13th centuries, describing events of the Viking Age, are among the greatest works of medieval literature. The family sagas, which describe the lives and conflicts and travels of specific historical families in the Norse world, combine realistic psychological characterization, careful attention to social and legal detail, a narrative style that prefers showing to telling, and that lets the reader draw their own moral conclusions from events presented with apparent objectivity, and a sense of the role of fate and personality in determining human outcomes that gives them a quality sometimes described as novelistic despite predating the novel by several centuries. The sagas were written by Icelanders looking back at the Viking Age from a Christian perspective, and their relationship to historical reality is complex. They preserve genuine historical memory about the settlement period and the early centuries of Icelandic history, but they also reflect the literary conventions and the retrospective perspectives of their composition period. Read with appropriate critical attention to these complexities. They provide one of the richest portraits of a medieval society available from any early medieval European tradition, and they have been studied intensively by historians, literary scholars, and anthropologists who find in them evidence for every aspect of Norse social and cultural life. The Norse exploration and settlement of the North Atlantic islands, the Faroe Islands, Iceland, Greenland, and eventually the coast of North America, represents one of the most remarkable episodes of human exploration in the pre-modern world, accomplished without navigational instruments beyond the most basic, in ships that the modern world would consider extraordinarily small and vulnerable for the conditions they encountered, driven by a combination of the push of overpopulation and political conflict in the homelands and the pull of reported land and opportunity ahead. Iceland was known to Irish monks before the Norse arrived. The monk de Kuel, writing around 825, describes islands in the Northern Ocean that monks had settled and that were accessible by sailing north from Britain for 2 days and a night. The Norse settlement of Iceland, beginning in earnest around 870, brought a wave of immigrants who came primarily from Norway, but also from the Norse settlements in Britain and Ireland, and whose migration reflected both the political turbulence of 9th century Norway and the availability of empty land at a time when agricultural land in Scandinavia was becoming increasingly scarce relative to population. The Landnámabók, the Book of Settlements, records the names and origins of approximately 400 original settlers and their families, a unique document in the history of medieval colonization that gives Iceland a more thoroughly documented founding than almost any other medieval settlement. The landscape the settlers found was remarkable and challenging, a subarctic island of geothermal activity, where geysers and hot springs and occasional volcanic eruptions reminded the inhabitants that the ground beneath their feet was not entirely stable, where winters were long and dark and cold, where the growing season was short, and where agriculture required adaptation to conditions quite different from those of the Norwegian homeland. The settlers brought their domestic animals, cattle, sheep, horses, pigs, and established the pastoral farming economy that has characterized Iceland ever since, supplemented by fishing in the extraordinarily rich waters of the North Atlantic. They also, relatively quickly, cut down most of the birch woodland that had covered portions of the island's interior, a deforestation whose environmental consequences the Icelanders would struggle with for the rest of their history. The Icelandic Althing, established around 930, was the institution that gave the Icelandic settlement its distinctive political character. Meeting annually at Ingvellir, the assembly plane, a geological rift in the landscape where the American and Eurasian tectonic plates meet, it was the legislative and judicial assembly of the entire island, governed by the law speaker who was required to recite 1/3 of the law code from memory each year. There was no king, no executive authority, no police force. Decisions of the Althing were enforced by the collective will of the freemen who participated in it, and by the social and legal mechanisms of honor and outlawry that organized Norse social relations. The Althing is sometimes described as the world's oldest parliament, and while this claim requires some qualification, it was not a parliament in any modern sense. It does represent a genuinely significant experiment in collective governance without central executive authority. The discovery and settlement of Greenland is associated by the sagas with Eric the Red, a Norse Icelander who was exiled from Iceland for manslaughter around 982 and who spent his exile years exploring a large landmass to the west that earlier voyagers had glimpsed. He returned to Iceland with reports of a territory he called Greenland, a name the sagas explicitly say he chose to attract settlers, since a good name would make people more willing to come, and in 985 or 986 led a colonization expedition of approximately 25 ships, of which 14 survived the crossing, establishing the eastern settlement and western settlement on the southwestern coast of Greenland, sheltered fjords where the climate was considerably more hospitable than the island's name suggested. The Greenlandic Norse community persisted for approximately 5 centuries, its population perhaps 4,000 to 5,000 people at its height, sustained by pastoral farming supplemented by hunting for walrus ivory and other northern goods that could be traded to Europe. The relationship between the Norse Greenlanders and the Thule Inuit who began moving into the same territory from the north in the 13th century was complex and poorly documented, but it appears to have included both conflict and trade, the Norse community eventually dwindling and disappearing from the historical record in the 15th century, the last confirmed contact from Europe dating to the 1410s. The mystery of what exactly happened to the Norse Greenlanders, why a community that had persisted for nearly 5 centuries disappeared without any clear documented catastrophe, has been the subject of considerable historical and archaeological investigation, with current scholarly thinking pointing toward a combination of deteriorating climate conditions, the collapse of the walrus ivory trade following the Black Death's disruption of European commercial networks, increased Inuit competition for resources, and the general difficulties of maintaining a European agricultural society at the margins of the habitable world without adequate external support. The Norse discovery of North America, Vinland, as the sagas call it, predates Columbus by approximately 5 centuries, and the archaeological evidence from Lance aux Meadows in Newfoundland, discovered by the Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad and his wife, the archaeologist Stein Ingstad, in 1960, confirms the Norse presence in the New World with physical certainty. The site, excavated in the 1960s and 1970s, revealed the remains of a Norse settlement of approximately 75 to 90 people, dated by radiocarbon analysis to around 1000 CE, including several turf longhouses of Scandinavian type, a smithy where iron was produced from bog ore, and various objects of Norse manufacture, including a bronze cloak pin and a spindle whorl of soapstone. The sagas give two somewhat different accounts of the Vinland voyages, centered on the figures of Leif Erikson and Thorvald Eriksson, and later Thorfinn Karlsefni and his wife Gudrid, whose story has been called the first European biography of a woman. Leif Erikson, sailing west from Greenland around 1000, reached a land of forests and wild grapes, the grapes giving it the name Vinland, the land of wine, and established a temporary base. Subsequent expeditions brought more people and attempted more permanent settlement, but conflicts with the indigenous inhabitants, called Skrælingr in the sagas, a term of uncertain but probably derogatory meaning, eventually led the Norse to abandon the attempt. The North American Norse presence, whatever its precise extent and duration, was not sufficient to establish a permanent settlement, and North America would remain unknown to European civilization for another 5 centuries. The North Atlantic settlements also show the limits of Viking expansion. The same maritime courage and technical skill that made the voyages possible did not guarantee that every colony could survive. Iceland succeeded because it had enough usable land, enough pasture, enough fish, and eventually enough social organization to sustain a population over time. Greenland survived for centuries, which itself is remarkable, but its environmental margin was narrow. A few degrees of climate change, a disruption in trade, a decline in European demand for walrus ivory, increased difficulty maintaining contact with Norway and Iceland, and the presence of Inuit communities better adapted to Arctic hunting created pressures that the Norse Greenlanders could not indefinitely absorb. The Vinland attempt was still more fragile. Lance aux Meadows was not a city or a large colony. It was a base, a workshop, a stopping place, a place where ships were repaired, iron was worked, and expeditions could move farther south or west. Its importance lies not in size, but in proof. For centuries, the saga accounts of voyages to Vinland belonged to the uncertain territory between memory and legend. The discovery of the Newfoundland site changed that. Turf buildings of unmistakably Norse type, ironworking evidence, and artifacts of Scandinavian manufacture confirmed that the sagas preserved a real historical event. Norse people crossed from Greenland to North America around the year 1000 and stayed long enough to build. The failure of permanent settlement in North America is also historically important. The Norse reached the continent, but they did not transform it. They encountered indigenous peoples whose own histories and territories long predated them, and they lacked the demographic weight, the logistical support, and perhaps the incentive to maintain a fragile outpost so far from Greenland. Their presence was real, but it was brief. This makes it more fascinating, not less. A small European fire lit on the edge of the North American world and then allowed to go out, leaving only turf outlines and archaeological traces to tell us that it had ever burned. Gudrid Thorbjarnardóttir, remembered in the sagas as one of the women who traveled to Vinland, gives this story a human face often missing from exploration narratives. She traveled from Iceland to Greenland and, according to the saga tradition, to North America. She bore a child associated with the Vinland expedition. She later traveled to Rome as a pilgrim and ended her life in Iceland. The details are filtered through saga memory, but the broad outline is extraordinary. The first European stories of North America are not only stories of men with swords and ships. They include women crossing oceans, managing households at the edge of the known world, carrying children through landscapes that none of their ancestors had imagined. The Norse impact on the English language is one of the most significant and most lasting legacies of the Viking Age, embedded so deeply in everyday English vocabulary that most speakers are unaware of how many common words they use every day that come from Old Norse. The very pronouns they, them, and there are Norse. Old English used a different set of third-person plural pronouns that were replaced by the Norse forms through the intimate contact of the Danelaw period. The words sky, skin, skull, wing, egg, knife, husband, window, anger, ugly, awkward, die, want, call, take, give, and dozens of other extremely common words are Old Norse in origin. The place names of northern and eastern England, the by and Thorpe and Thwaite endings already mentioned, record the physical settlement of Norse-speaking people in what had been English-speaking territory. The Old Norse influence on English is not a superficial borrowing of exotic vocabulary, but a deep structural influence on the basic vocabulary of everyday life, reflecting the intimate and extended contact between Norse and English populations in the Danelaw. The Christianization of the Norse world, which proceeded unevenly through the 10th and 11th centuries, transformed Norse culture without entirely eliminating the older traditions that had shaped it. Norway was formally Christianized during the reign of Olaf Haraldsson, later Saint Olaf, who died in battle in 1030 at Stiklestad, and was quickly venerated as a martyr by a church eager to promote his cult as an instrument of Norwegian Christianity. Denmark was Christianized under Harald Bluetooth in the 960s. Sweden resisted longer, with pagan practices maintained in some areas into the 12th century. Iceland adopted Christianity by the decision of the Althing in the year 1000, in a characteristically pragmatic Norse compromise. Pagans and Christians would both practice their own religion privately, but public religious practice would be Christian. Christianization also changed kingship. A pagan chieftain could claim descent, luck, generosity, courage, and the favor of gods, but a Christian king could claim sacred legitimacy through baptism, church support, written law, and alignment with the broader diplomatic world of Latin Christendom. Bishops became political allies. Monasteries became centers of literacy and administration. Latin charters fixed grants and privileges in writing. Coinage, taxation, and royal law developed in ways that required new administrative habits. The conversion of Scandinavia was not only a change of belief, it was a state-building process. The Old World did not vanish at once. Thor's hammer pendants appear in archaeological contexts alongside crosses, suggesting that some people navigated the transition through overlap rather than immediate replacement. Stories of Odin and Thor continued to be told after baptism. Old poetic forms continued to be used by Christian poets. Legal assemblies continued to meet. Family honor and feud did not disappear because churches were built. The Viking Age ended not because Scandinavian people stopped being energetic, violent, commercial, or mobile, but because the framework around that energy changed. Raiding gave way to royal warfare. Chieftains became king's men. Pagan cult gave way to parish and diocese. Oral memory gave way increasingly to written record. The transition to Christianity did not mean the extinction of Norse culture. The Icelandic sagas, composed in the Christian centuries, preserved the mythology and the historical memory of the pagan past with evident literary appreciation, even as they frame their narratives within a Christian worldview. The Norse artistic traditions continued and adapted, the interlaced patterns and zoomorphic designs of Norse art appearing in the decoration of Christian churches and manuscripts. The Norse legal traditions were preserved and codified in writing after Christianization, the Thing system continuing to function within the new Christian political framework. What changed was the cosmological framework. The gods gave way to God. Valhalla gave way to heaven. The Valkyries gave way to angels. But the human culture that inhabited this new framework retained enormous continuity with what had come before. The end of the Viking Age is usually placed around 1100, but this is partly a historiographical convention rather than a clear historical fact. The processes that had characterized the Viking Age, raiding, trading, settling, exploring, did not stop in 1100. They continued in modified forms as the Norse political world became increasingly organized into the medieval kingdoms of Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, as those kingdoms were integrated into the broader framework of Latin Christian Europe. And as the Norse populations already settled in Britain and France and Russia and Iceland and Greenland continued to live out the cultural consequences of the movements that the previous 3 centuries had set in motion. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 is sometimes identified as marking the end of the Viking Age, and there is something symbolically apt in this framing. The descendants of Norse settlers in France, thoroughly Frenchified in language and culture, but still fierce and organized military actors, completing the Norse engagement with England by imposing on it a French-speaking aristocracy that would reshape English culture in ways almost as profound as the Danelaw settlement had done. The Norman conquest is, in a sense, the Viking Age's last act, the final consequence of the Norse expansion, arriving at its destination by a very long and indirect route. The northern and western islands of Britain became some of the most thoroughly Norse-shaped landscapes outside Scandinavia itself. Orkney and Shetland, lying north of mainland Scotland, were not simply raided and left behind. They became Norse societies, ruled by jarls whose power connected the islands to Norway, Scotland, Ireland, and the wider North Atlantic. The very place names of those islands still preserve the depth of this settlement. Farms, bays, headlands, and islands carry names that come from Old Norse, recording a linguistic occupation of the landscape that lasted long after political authority changed. In Orkney, the great chambered tomb of Maesho, much older than the Vikings, contains runic graffiti carved by Norse visitors who broke into the monument in the 12th century and left messages that are sometimes boastful, sometimes comic, sometimes oddly ordinary. It is one of the strangest forms of historical intimacy. Medieval Norse people scratching their names and jokes inside a prehistoric tomb, turning a monument already ancient to them into a casual wall of memory. The Isle of Man was another deeply Norse Gaelic world, positioned in the Irish Sea between Ireland, Scotland, England, and Wales. Its Viking Age and later medieval crosses preserve a hybrid art in which Christian symbols and Norse decorative forms occupy the same stone. A cross could carry Christian imagery while its carved patterns still remembered the animal interlace and mythic imagination of Scandinavia. This is one of the great themes of the Viking diaspora. Cultures did not simply replace one another. They braided together. Norse settlers married into Gaelic families, adopted local customs, imposed some of their own, and produced communities that were neither purely Scandinavian nor purely Gaelic, but something made from both. In the Hebrides and along the western coast of Scotland, Norse influence persisted in political structures, seafaring habits, personal names, and place names for centuries. The Kingdom of the Isles, later tied to both Norway and Scotland, was a maritime world in which ships mattered more than roads, and sea lanes connected communities that modern maps might make look remote. From the deck of a boat, islands are not isolated dots. They are stepping stones. The Viking sense of geography was maritime rather than continental. A fjord, a bay, a river mouth, an island anchorage, these were not edges of the world but entrances into it. The making of Scandinavian kingdoms changed the character of Viking activity from within. Denmark, because of its geography between the North Sea and the Baltic and its access to the European mainland, developed more centralized royal power earlier than Norway or Sweden. The Great Ring fortresses associated with Harald Bluetooth, such as Trelleborg and Firket, show a level of planning and royal organization that marks a very different stage from the looser chieftain world of the early Viking Age. These fortresses, circular, symmetrical, carefully measured, and placed strategically, were not the work of independent raiding crews. They were the work of a king who could command labor, standardize design, and think in terms of kingdom-wide power. Harald Bluetooth himself stands at one of the great turning points. The large runestone at Jelling in Denmark, often called Denmark's birth certificate, proclaims that Harald won all Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian. The statement is royal propaganda, and like all royal propaganda, it simplifies reality, but it tells us what kind of king Harald wanted to be seen as, not simply a war leader, but the ruler of a people, the maker of a Christian kingdom, the man who placed Denmark inside the diplomatic and religious world of Christian Europe. The stone carries both runic inscription and Christian imagery, a monument to conversion and kingship carved in the old alphabet of the North. Norway's path was rougher and more fragmented, shaped by mountains, fjords, regional chieftains, and the difficulty of imposing royal authority over a coastline so long and broken that local power could resist central power for generations. The sagas remember kings like Harald Fairhair and Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf Haraldsson as dramatic figures in the making of Norway, though the historical details are wrapped in later literary tradition. What matters for the broader story is that the Viking Age was also the age in which the Scandinavian homelands themselves were transformed. The men who had gone abroad for silver and land returned to a world increasingly shaped by kings, churches, coins, and written law. Sweden's Viking Age looked east more strongly than west. Swedish traders and warriors were especially active along the routes toward the Baltic, the Volga, the Dnieper, the Islamic world, and Byzantium. The island of Gotland became extraordinarily rich from this trade, as the silver hoards found their demonstrate. Gotlandic farmers buried Arabic dirhams, silver ornaments, and hack silver in quantities that still astonish archaeologists. The island's position in the Baltic made it a kind of commercial hinge between Scandinavia and the East, and its archaeological record reminds us that the Viking world cannot be understood only from the perspective of England and France. The East was not a side story. For many Scandinavians, it was the main route to wealth. Runes were more than letters, though they were certainly letters. The runic alphabet, or futhark, could be used for practical inscriptions, names, ownership marks, memorial formulas, jokes, merchant marks, brief messages, but it also carried an aura of power because writing itself was powerful in a largely oral society. To cut words into wood, bone, metal, or stone was to make speech durable. A name carved on a stone could outlast the mouth that spoke it. A memorial inscription could keep kinship visible in the landscape for generations. A short inscription on an object could mark ownership, invoke protection, or simply announce presence. I was here. Most runic inscriptions are not mysterious spells. Many are direct, functional, and human. A man raised this stone in memory of his brother. A woman had this bridge made for her husband. A warrior died in the East. Someone carved these runes. Someone loved someone enough to pay for stone and labor and public memory. This simplicity is part of their power. The grand narratives of the Viking Age are made of ships and kings and battles, but the runestones preserve grief, pride, family obligation, and the desire not to be forgotten. The later medieval fascination with runes as magical signs has some basis in Norse tradition, because inscriptions could be used in charms, and because the myth of Odin discovering the runes gives them sacred significance. But reducing runes to magic misses their everyday importance. They were the writing system through which a society that prized speech and memory began to fix certain words permanently. In that transition from voice to mark, from spoken reputation to carved remembrance, we can see one of the deeper transformations of the Viking world. Women in the Viking world are often flattened in modern imagination into two opposing stereotypes: passive wives waiting in smoky halls, or fantasy shield maidens standing in the front line of battle. The historical reality is more interesting. Women managed households, controlled stores, arranged marriages, raised children, supervised textile production, participated in property transactions, and, in the saga literature, could be formidable political actors through speech, memory, pressure, and the manipulation of honor. A woman's words could push men toward vengeance or settlement. A marriage alliance could redirect the future of families. A widow of means could exercise authority that a married woman under tighter household structures might not. The question of women warriors in the Viking Age should be handled carefully. There are legendary shield maidens in the sagas and later medieval literature, and some archaeological graves with weapons have been reinterpreted in recent scholarship as possibly belonging to women. But evidence of women participating regularly in battle is much more limited than popular culture suggests. It is safer to say that Norse culture imagined martial women, and that at least some women may have occupied roles outside the conventional domestic pattern, while still recognizing that warfare in the Viking Age, as a social institution, was overwhelmingly male. This balance matters because exaggerating the evidence does not help the history. The real power of Norse women does not require turning every woman into a warrior. Household authority, textile production, property, ritual status, memory, and kinship politics were forms of power that mattered deeply in the society as it actually functioned. The vulva, the seeress or ritual specialist associated with prophecy and seer, occupies one of the most striking positions in the Norse imagination. The Voluspa, the great poem of the Poetic Edda, is spoken by a seeress who addresses Odin and tells him the history of the cosmos from creation to destruction and renewal. In the sagas, seeresses appear with staffs, special clothing, ritual seats, songs, and an authority that is both respected and feared. Whether the literary descriptions preserve exact pagan practice is debated, but they point toward a religious world in which certain women could mediate knowledge, fate, and the unseen. That role sits uneasily beside the male warrior ideal, and that uneasiness is precisely what makes the culture complex. Daily life in the Viking Age was more physical than most modern lives in ways that are difficult to exaggerate. Wood had to be cut, water had to be carried, animals had to be fed, milked, slaughtered, guarded, and moved. Fields had to be cleared, plowed, sown, weeded, harvested, and protected. Iron had to be smelted, hammered, repaired, and sharpened. Houses leaked smoke. Winter darkness lasted for long months in the north. Hunger was never an abstract possibility. A failed harvest, a drowned boat, a disease among animals, or the death of a key adult could place an entire household at risk. This physical world produced people who were practical in ways that the sagas often assume rather than explain. A warrior also knew farming. A trader could repair a ship. A household woman knew food preservation, textile work, medicine of some kind, accounts of stores, and the social obligations of hospitality. A child learned early that survival was communal. Laziness was dangerous not because it violated an abstract moral code, but because work left undone became hunger, cold, debt, or shame. Hospitality, therefore, had a seriousness that modern comfort can obscure. In a world of long distances, poor roads, harsh weather, and limited inns, a traveler needed halls willing to receive him. The Havamal, with its practical advice about how to behave as guest and host, reflects this world. Do not be greedy. Do not overstay. Do not speak foolishly. Carry wisdom. Keep friends. Be cautious. Understand that a warm fire and a place to sit can mean survival. The ethics of hospitality were not decorative politeness. They were a social technology for living in a dangerous landscape. The image of the berserker, the warrior in a state of terrifying battle fury, belongs to the Viking imagination, but it too requires care. The sources describe berserker and Lindisfarne, men associated with bears and wolves, warriors who fought with unusual ferocity and who may have belonged to specific warrior bands or ritual traditions. Later writers describe them biting shields, entering trances, becoming insensitive to pain, and terrifying their enemies. How much of this reflects actual battlefield behavior, how much poetic exaggeration, and how much later literary shaping is debated. But the existence of the idea tells us something important. Norse warrior culture recognized the possibility of a fighting state that was not merely technical skill but transformation, a temporary passage into something more animal, more dangerous, and less socially controlled. That danger was double-edged. A society could admire ferocity in war and still fear uncontrolled violence at home. The sagas are full of men whose strength is socially useful in one context and socially destructive in another. The same courage that makes a man valuable in battle can make him impossible in a legal dispute. The same refusal to accept insult that preserves honor can prolong a feud until families are ruined. Viking culture valued courage, but it was not blind to the cost of courage when detached from judgment. The sources for Viking history are uneven, and that unevenness shapes everything we think we know. For the raids in Western Europe, many of the written sources were produced by the victims, monks, clerics, royal annalists, and Christian scholars who had every reason to describe the Norse in the darkest possible terms. For the Norse themselves, the richest literary sources were written down later, especially in Iceland, after conversion to Christianity and after the Viking Age had already become a remembered past. Archaeology fills some gaps, but archaeology speaks in objects, buildings, burials, isotopes, DNA, pollen, and settlement layers rather than in continuous narrative. It can tell us where people lived, what they ate, how they moved, what they made, what they buried, and sometimes where they came from. It cannot always tell us what they thought they were doing. A good account of the Vikings therefore has to move between hostile written testimony, later literary memory, and material evidence. Lindisfarne tells us what a raid felt like to those attacked. The Gokstad ship tells us what the technology made possible. Silver hoards tell us where wealth flowed. Place names tell us where settlers stayed long enough to name fields and villages. Sagas tell us what later Norse-speaking Christians thought was worth remembering about their ancestors. None of these sources is enough alone. Together, they produce a world more complicated than any single source would allow. The gift economy of the Viking world helps explain both loyalty and violence. A chieftain did not rule simply because he possessed a title. He ruled because he could give. Rings, weapons, feasts, ships, land, protection, and opportunities for profit flowed outward from a successful leader to his followers, and honor and service flowed back. A poor leader who could not reward men lost them. A generous leader who returned from voyages with silver and glory gained reputation, and reputation brought more followers, and more followers made larger voyages possible. This feedback loop is one of the engines of the Viking Age. Success at sea created wealth. Wealth created loyalty. Loyalty created the manpower for further expeditions. Feasting was therefore political. A hall feast was not merely a meal. It was a public display of abundance, hierarchy, and obligation. The host showed that he had enough food, drink, animals, servants, and prestige to gather people under his roof. The guests accepted hospitality and thereby acknowledged relationship. Stories were told. Poetry was performed. Gifts were given. Insults could be made or avoided. Marriages could be negotiated. Alliances could be strengthened. A feast could settle tension, but it could also expose it. In the sagas, dangerous conversations often happen over drink, because the hall is where private feeling becomes public speech. Weapons carried both practical and symbolic weight. The sword was the most prestigious weapon, expensive to produce, and often named in saga tradition as if it had a personality of its own. Many warriors carried spears, axes, knives, and shields because these were more accessible and practical. The round shield, painted and edged, was both protection and visual display. Helmets existed, though the horned helmet of modern costume imagination did not belong to Viking battle practice. Mail shirts were valuable and not universal. A fully equipped warrior with sword, mail, helmet, spear, axe, and shield represented wealth as much as martial identity. Many men who fought did so with more modest equipment, and the archaeological record reminds us that the Viking battlefield was not populated entirely by museum-quality warriors. The axe deserves particular attention because it became one of the most recognizable weapons of the Norse world. A farm tool and a weapon could be closely related, and that relationship matters. A man who knew how to cut wood, shape timber, and work with an axe in ordinary life could carry some of that bodily familiarity into combat. The broad-bladed Dane axe of the later Viking Age, used with two hands and capable of terrible cutting power, became especially associated with elite warriors and later with the housecarls of Anglo-Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon military culture. At Hastings in 1066, the English warriors who faced William of Normandy included men whose heavy axes belonged to this northern military tradition. Even at the end of the Viking Age, its weapons were still shaping battles. Armor, however, should not be exaggerated. Popular images often show rows of heavily armored Vikings, but iron was expensive, mail was labor-intensive, and many raiders likely fought with limited protection. A shield wall did not require every man to be encased in metal. It required discipline, courage, and coordination. The shield wall was not a romantic abstraction, but a terrifying physical reality. Wood and iron pressed against wood and iron. Men close enough to smell each other's breath. Spears probing for gaps. Axes striking over rims. Wounded men falling underfoot, and the line holding or breaking by inches. In such a fight, courage meant not rushing forward alone, but staying where the line needed you to stay. The Viking relationship with Christianity before conversion was also more complicated than simple hatred. Raiders attacked churches because churches were rich and poorly defended, but traders dealt with Christians constantly. Norse leaders accepted baptism strategically at times, especially when negotiating with Christian rulers, receiving gifts, or entering treaties. Some may have treated baptism as a political ritual rather than an exclusive change of faith, at least at first. Amulets combining Thor's hammer forms with cross-like shapes suggest a period in which identities overlapped. A man could wear one symbol, accept another, and move through a world where the boundary between sincere conversion and practical accommodation was not always clear. Missionaries entering Scandinavia faced a society that did not lack religion but possessed a different kind of religious structure. There was no single pagan church to defeat, no central scripture to refute, no priesthood equivalent to the Christian clergy. Religion was local, household-based, cultic, poetic, and embedded in seasonal ritual, ancestor memory, sacrifice, and social practice. Conversion therefore proceeded unevenly, through kings, through trade towns, through marriage alliances, through law assemblies, through royal pressure, through the prestige of Christian Europe, and through the practical benefits of belonging to the diplomatic world of Christian rulers. The adoption of Christianity was a spiritual event for some and a political necessity for others, and often both at once. The Viking raids on Francia reveal the scale on which maritime violence could operate against a wealthy but politically strained empire. Viking fleets moved up the Seine, the Loire, the Garonne, and other rivers, attacking monasteries, towns, and royal estates far inland. Paris was attacked repeatedly in the 9th century, most famously in 845, when a Viking force under a leader often identified as Ragnar or Reginhurus received an enormous payment to withdraw, and again in 885 to 886, when a much larger siege tested the defenses of the city and the authority of the late Carolingian rulers. These attacks show why the Viking threat felt so destabilizing. A city far from the open coast could still be reached by river. Fortifications that had not been maintained suddenly mattered. Political weakness became visible on the water. Tribute payments, often called Danegeld in the English context, were a rational response to immediate danger and a dangerous long-term habit. Paying a Viking army to leave could save a town from destruction, preserve lives, and buy time. But it also advertised that violence could be profitable. A successful payment could bring the same army back or attract another. Medieval rulers were not fools when they paid. They were often trapped by the immediate impossibility of military response. Yet the accumulated effect of payments helped finance further Viking activity and turned some raiding armies into mobile political actors who negotiated like states before they had settled as states. The environmental range of Viking activity is also striking. The same culture that operated in the damp fields of England, the river corridors of Russia, the Mediterranean service of Byzantium, and the cold fjords of Greenland had to adapt to each zone. There was no single Viking landscape after expansion began. In Ireland, settlement meant navigating Gaelic kingship and monastic wealth. In England, it meant farming in villages that already had centuries of Anglo-Saxon history. In Normandy, it meant becoming Frankish aristocrats. In the East, it meant trading with Islamic markets and Byzantine officials. In Iceland, it meant inventing a society without kings. In Greenland, it meant trying to make European pastoral life work at the edge of the Arctic. The success of the Norse was not only that they traveled far, it was that they adapted differently wherever they arrived. The physical remains of the Viking world are scattered across an enormous geography, and the experience of encountering them is one of the more affecting that the study of the early medieval world offers. The ship burials of Norway, the Oseberg and Gokstad ships, buried with their high-status occupants along with elaborate grave goods, horses, dogs, and the full equipment of aristocratic life, are among the most remarkable finds in the history of archaeology, and the ships themselves, preserved by the clay that surrounded them for 1,000 years, still communicate something of the beauty and the technical sophistication of the tradition that built them. The runestones of Sweden, raised in their hundreds by families commemorating members who died in distant places, the man who died in the East, the man who died in England, the man who died in the service of a Greek king, give a vivid sense of the geographical range of Norse activity through the specific, personal records of individuals and families. The Icelandic landscape, where the turf farmhouses of the Saga age can still be walked, where the Ingvellir Plain where the Althing met for centuries is still a place of extraordinary geological and historical resonance, where the glaciers and the volcanic plains and the long summer nights give a physical context for the world the sagas describe. The legacy of the Vikings in the modern world is complex and somewhat contested. 19th century Romanticism, particularly in Germany and Britain and Scandinavia, created a highly idealized image of the Norse world that emphasized martial heroism, racial vigor, and a pre-Christian freedom from what the Romantics saw as the oppressive civilization of medieval Christianity. This idealization was sometimes taken in very dangerous directions. most notoriously in the appropriation of Norse symbols and mythology by 20th century fascism, which used the runic alphabet and the iconography of Norse mythology for its own purposes in ways that have permanently associated certain Norse symbols with political movements that have nothing to do with the actual history and culture of medieval Scandinavia. The recovery of a more historically grounded understanding of the Norse world, driven by the growth of academic archaeology and medieval studies over the past century, has produced a picture very different from either the romantic idealization or its fascist appropriation. The actual Vikings were not uniformly heroic or uniformly violent. They were people living in a particular time and place with particular cultural values and particular economic pressures, capable of extraordinary violence and extraordinary creativity, of remarkable courage and remarkable brutality, of artistic achievement of real beauty and commercial enterprise of remarkable range, of the practical flexibility that allowed them to adapt to enormously varied circumstances across the enormous geographical range of their activities. Health and injury in the Viking world were constant facts of life. Skeletons from Viking Age burials show the marks of hard physical labor, worn joints, healed fractures, dental wear, signs of infection, and the bodily consequences of a world in which most work was manual and most healing was limited. A cut from a tool could become dangerous if infection set in. A broken bone might heal badly. A toothache could become a crisis. Childbirth was dangerous. Childhood was dangerous. The toughness of Norse society was not an aesthetic pose. It was partly a response to a world where pain, cold, hunger, and bodily risk were ordinary companions. Medicine existed, but it was not modern medicine. People used herbs, experience, charms, cautery, splints, massage, and practical knowledge passed down through households and specialists. Archaeological finds from some graves include tools that may have been used for surgical or medical purposes, and saga literature preserves scenes of wound examination and treatment that suggest an awareness of practical injury care. But the boundary between healing, magic, religion, and ordinary household knowledge was not drawn as sharply as it is in modern thought. A healer might know plants, songs, ritual actions, and the handling of wounds, and all of these could be understood as part of one approach to restoring a damaged body. Winter shaped the emotional life of the Norse world. In summer there was travel, haymaking, fishing, raiding, trading, building, and movement. In winter there was enclosure. People gathered indoors for longer periods. Animals were brought closer, food stores were watched carefully, and the hall became the center of social existence. This is one reason storytelling mattered so much. A long winter night needed words, genealogies, poems, law, gossip, insults, memories of voyages, stories of gods, stories of ancestors, and the careful verbal art of men and women who could hold attention when there was little light outside and nothing to do but listen. The Norse relationship to animals was equally intimate. Horses carried status and mobility, and in some contexts carried religious importance. Dogs appear in graves and stories as companions and working animals. Cattle were wealth. Sheep were wool, goats were milk, pigs were meat, and cats helped protect stored grain from rodents. In Iceland and Greenland, livestock survival could determine human survival, and the decision of how many animals to keep through winter was a calculation between hope and realism. Too many animals might exhaust fodder. Too few might leave the household poor in spring. A farm was a living system of humans, animals, buildings, fields, stores, and weather, and a mistake in one part of the system could echo through all the others. Children in this world grew into responsibility early. They learned by watching before they learned by formal instruction. A boy might learn boat handling, farming, tools, weapons, and the codes of male honor. A girl might learn textile production, dairy work, household management, memory of kinship, and the social intelligence required to manage relationships in a world of closely connected families. But these divisions were not absolute in every circumstance, especially in small or difficult households where everyone had to contribute what the situation required. Childhood existed, but it was not protected from work and danger in the modern sense. The world expected children to become useful quickly. All of this everyday life matters because it is the base from which the dramatic Viking story rises. A raid begins long before the ship touches a foreign shore. It begins with iron smelted, wool spun, animals raised, food dried, timber cut, debts incurred, oaths sworn, and young men convinced that the risk is worth taking. Exploration begins long before a coast is sighted. It begins with generations learning currents, building hulls, memorizing stories of distant lands, and believing that an unknown horizon might contain pasture, silver, honor, or death. The Viking Age was spectacular because the expeditions were spectacular, but those expeditions rested on ordinary labor that rarely entered the heroic poems. The modern fascination with the Vikings often tells us as much about the modern world as about the medieval one. Some people want them to be pure heroes, free men of the North untouched by the compromises of civilization. Others want them to be only villains, proof that violence and piracy are all the word Viking should mean. Neither image is historically adequate. The real Norse world is more interesting because it does not fit easily into moral simplicity. A man could be a loving father, a skilled farmer, a poet of great sensitivity, and a participant in slave-taking violence. A community could create beautiful art and conduct brutal raids. A ship could carry a bride, a merchant, a missionary, a corpse, a cargo of silver, or a band of armed men preparing to kill. That moral complexity is part of why the subject holds attention. The Vikings are close enough to us through language, literature, and archaeology to feel almost knowable, but distant enough in values to resist comfortable identification. Their courage can be admired. Their violence cannot be romanticized. Their ships can be celebrated. The captives they carried cannot be ignored. Their poetry can move us. Their world can still disturb us. A strong history of the Vikings has to hold all of this at once, because only then does the Viking Age become what it actually was. Not a fantasy of horned helmets, not a simple nightmare of raiders, but a human world moving with unusual speed across a medieval map that it helped redraw. They left behind, in the ship graves and the runestones and the saga literature and the place names and the English pronouns and the Norman castles and the Rurikid dynasty and the Irish cities and the Newfoundland archaeological site. One of the most widely distributed bodies of evidence for any pre-modern culture that was not itself an empire in the conventional sense. Evidence that continues to be found and studied and interpreted and reinterpreted as our understanding of the medieval world grows more sophisticated and more complete. One more reason the Vikings remain so compelling is that their world sits at the edge of record and legend. We know too much about them to dismiss them as myth, and too little to make them fully ordinary. A ship burial gives us wood, iron, animal bones, textiles, and status objects, but not the exact words spoken at the funeral. A saga gives us dialogue, motives, insults, and unforgettable scenes, but not always the certainty of eyewitness history. A runestone gives us a name and a journey, but rarely enough to know the full life behind it. The historian has to assemble the Viking world from fragments that do not all speak the same language. That fragmentary quality is part of the atmosphere. The Vikings appear in the records of their enemies as terror, in their own later literature as memory, in archaeology as objects, in place names as traces, in language as inheritance, and in modern imagination as a set of images so powerful that they constantly threaten to overwhelm the evidence. The work of understanding them is the work of pulling those layers apart. The real raider from the mythic warrior, the trader from the pirate, the settler from the invader, the farmer from the sea king, the woman at the loom from the man at the oar, the enslaved captive from the wealthy chieftain whose grave preserved the tools of his power. When those layers are held together rather than simplified, the Viking Age becomes more interesting, not less. It becomes a story about mobility and risk, about how technology changes history, about how violence and commerce can travel on the same hull, about how cultures transform when they meet, and about how a relatively small population on the northern edge of Europe could, for 3 centuries, force nearly every society around the North Sea, the Baltic, the Atlantic, and the Eastern river routes to take notice. It also becomes a story about endings that are not really endings. The Viking Age ends in textbooks because historians need boundaries, but the people did not wake up one morning and stop being who they were. The crews became subjects of kings. The raiding leaders became aristocrats or outlaws. The trading towns became medieval cities. The old gods became literature. The assemblies became part of Christian law. The Norse language survived in Iceland and the Faroes, merged into English in the Danelaw, disappeared into French in Normandy, and left traces in Russian and Ukrainian historical memory through the Rus. The transformation was gradual, uneven, and local, which is why the ending of the Viking Age feels less like a door closing than like a tide turning. That is perhaps the most accurate final image, a tide. It comes in violently in some places, quietly in others. It changes the shore, carries things away, leaves things behind, and withdraws without returning the landscape to what it was before. The Viking Age was such a tide. The water has gone back out. The marks remain. Even the word Viking now carries that afterlife. It has become a symbol used in museums, politics, sports teams, fantasy, nationalism, tourism, scholarship, and entertainment, often far removed from the people who first carried oars across the cold water. The historical task is not to strip the word of its power, but to return depth to it. Behind the symbol were real communities, real ships, real victims, real craftsmen, real farms, real graves, real languages, and real choices. The more carefully we look, the less the Vikings resemble a single image, and the more they become a civilization in motion. That civilization in motion is why the subject remains strong for a History at Bedtime episode. It contains violence, but also travel, darkness, but also craftsmanship, mythology, but also law, terror, but also settlement, endings, but also transformation. It has the scale of an epic and the intimacy of a name carved into stone by someone who wanted one dead person remembered. And that is the best way to hear them, not as costumes, not as slogans, not as monsters or superheroes, but as people whose world was colder, harder, more dangerous, more mobile, and more entangled with ours than the old caricature ever allowed. They were never only one thing. That is why they still hold attention after 1,000 years. Their story keeps widening the longer one looks. Every shore they reached adds another layer to the meaning of the Viking Age. The evidence keeps answering differently in every place. The longships are gone. The halls where the skalds performed are gone. The public worship of the gods of Asgard gave way to other religious worlds and other stories. But the world the Norse made, the connections they created, the settlements they founded, the languages they shaped, the literature they produced, is still here, in forms that require only a little archaeological and historical attention to become visible. The Whale Road is still there. The sea is still cold. The stars by which the Norse navigated are still the same stars. And somewhere, under a Newfoundland meadow, the embers of the Norse hearth fire that burned there 1,000 years ago are still in the earth, a small cold relic of the furthest west that the longships ever reached. We have followed them from the fjords of Norway to the monasteries of Lindisfarne, from the river systems of Eastern Europe to the courts of Byzantium, from the Danelaw of England to the wine lands of North America. We have sat in their halls and heard their poetry and understood something of the gods they worshipped and the courage they valued and the ships that made everything possible. They were raiders, yes, but they were also traders and settlers and explorers and poets and lawgivers. They shaped the English language, helped form the Russ political world, settled Iceland and Greenland, and touched the coast of Newfoundland. They were, in the complexity and the energy and the global reach of their 3 centuries of activity, one of the most consequential peoples in the history of the medieval world. The longships have long since returned to the sea from which they came, but their wake is still visible in the world. Sleep well. Good night.